Sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to CalMatters and our latest edition of Getting Through Coronavirus Explained. My name is Vanessa Richardson. I'm the Director of Events for CalMatters. A little bit about us. CalMatters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom committed to explaining California policy and politics, or as Governor Newsom likes to call us yesterday, as he did in his press conference, one of the state's newspapers. Because the coronavirus pandemic and the shutdown is impacting pretty much all of our reporting and state coverage these days, we've been doing this series of virtual events in which we have our team of CalMatters reporters talk with California policymakers and professionals who are tasked with getting us through this shutdown. Our Getting Through Coronavirus Explained series comes from Southern California Gas Company, better known as SoCal Gas, based in Los Angeles. These events have focused on topics like what help is being offered to homeowners, renters, and the unhoused right now, what's affecting California's food supply chain during the shutdown and how to fix it, how teachers, parents, and students are handling homeschooling and online education and what they should expect for the next school year, and how people can keep their mental health strong and steady during these tough times. And all those events live here on our YouTube page. Us today to host this event is our CalMatters reporter, Ben Christopher. He covers elections, politics, and the economy. And this week, Ben has been working on a story about how California cities are weathering the economic downturn, where they can turn for help, and how this downturn compares to the Great Recession that many cities in California have only just fully recovered from. So today we're going to join Ben in his reporting on that story. He'll be speaking with two mayors in California. One is in charge of a small town in NorCal that's heavily dependent on tourism. The other manages the second largest city in the state. But both are tasked with making tough decisions today about their city budgets, what to keep, where to cut, and how to move forward as California budget deficit in state history. We want you to be part of this conversation as well. Please submit your questions by typing them into the chat box on the right-hand side of the YouTube screen. Ben will ask a mix of reader questions and his own questions. And before I turn it over to Ben, I want to remind you of our continued regular coverage of the coronavirus pandemic and how you can keep track of it. For a rundown of daily news happening around the state, please sign up for our newsletter. It's called What Matters, and it comes to your inbox every morning. Track of our video explainers, our documentaries, and the virtual events we're doing like these. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we also have a podcast hub at SoundCloud. And today, which is known as the Big Day of Giving, consider becoming a CalMatters member or donor. Our nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism on the issues that matter most to you in California's capital. All the information needed to do that is on our website at calmatters.org. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Ben.
Great. Thanks so much, Vanessa. And hello, everyone who's watching. So thanks so much for taking the time out of your Thursday to be part of this conversation. Right now, California is facing two parallel crises. First, there's the public health emergency, which is obviously and rightfully top of mind for everyone. But there is also the economic crisis, which is in many ways just as profound and just as unprecedented. There's a recent survey that showed that 20% of Californians have lost their jobs since mid-March. Another 20% have seen their hours cut or pay cut. And today, as my colleague Judy Lynn reported this morning, the governor's office is now projecting a $54.3 billion deficit and an unemployment rate that could reach 18%. And if you are not someone who follows these numbers regularly, these are really horrifically large numbers. They've affected and are going to affect household finances. It's obviously affecting the state, but it has also put and will continue to put enormous strain on many city budgets across California. The cities provide many of the basic services we take for granted. They are the level of government that most people interact with the most on a daily basis. As much as we might like to complain about what's going on in Washington, D.C., is what's happening at City Hall that often has the most direct impact for people's daily lives. So the questions that I would like to ask today is just how bad is this going to be for cities, and what can they do to react to this new economic climate? And I'm going to be to our two guests. So first, we're joined by Mayor John Dunbar. He's the mayor of Yountville in Napa County, and he is also the president of the League of California Cities. So he can provide some insight both into how this crisis is affecting his particular city in Northern California, but also how cities across the state are coping. So Mayor Dunbar, thanks so much for agreeing to join us.
My pleasure.
And then we're also joined by Mayor Kevin Faulconer, the mayor of the city of San Diego. Mayor Faulconer, welcome.
Ben, thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
Well, thank you. So one of the things that I think is so unusual, I mean, reporters were sort of running out of synonyms for unprecedented, but the thing that is really unprecedented about this economic downturn is just how quickly it set in. During the Great Recession, cities may have had months and months to adjust their finances to the new reality, whereas in this case, mid-March, the governor declared a shelter-in-place order, counties followed suit, and just like that, consumer spending grinds to a halt effectively. So my first question, I'm wondering if you could just kind of set the scene for us. I'm curious what the economy was like in your two cities pandemic, and when was it that you realized that this could really have a serious financial consequence for your city? So Mayor Dunbar, would you like to start with that?
Sure. Thank you very much. It has been unprecedented, as you were just describing. In Yountville, we're in the middle of the Napa Valley wine country here in Napa County, north of San Francisco. And we have seen, unfortunately, our share of natural and other types of disasters. Through the wildfires back in 2017, we saw significant economic impact from that when, by the threat of fire, we had our entire economy shut down. It was not nearly as prolonged as what we're seeing right now. We have seen this before, but in my lifetime, the only one that compares is 9/11, 20 years ago, when virtually the nation immediately came to a level of, airlines stopped flying, businesses in some cases closed, and protocols were completely different the day before. And now what I see as the difference is that this touches literally every sector in our economy. First and foremost is the public health sector, where we are trying to put all of the resources that we can get at the local level from the state of California and from the federal government to help support all of us. Because what used to be considered normal fiscal responsibility with public safety and other critical municipal services, those haven't gone away. This is on top of all that. So we are looking in Yountville specifically at about a 74% loss in revenue, purely based on transient occupancy tax or hotel tax and sales tax combined. You can imagine losing almost 75% of your budget is significant. We are very fortunate that we had in place some fairly healthy reserves that we are going to need to rely on. But I recognize that out of our 482 cities that have the kind of reserve stability that we can reach into right now. And so it's going to be a real challenge going forward.
Okay, and before I get Mayor Faulconer's take, I just want to stop there for a second. You said 75% of your revenue.
Yes, unfortunately, you heard me correctly.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, we have about, and the numbers are very different in Mayor Faulconer's line items, but we have about $11.5 million budget, and we're projecting $6 million loss in the next fiscal year. Thankfully, we have $4 million in reserves that we can tap into, but this is why it is so. We are an example of why it's so critical that we can get support as quickly as possible from the state of California. And some of the funding that has been received by the CARES Act funding from Congress, but those numbers, those dollars are only really reaching the largest cities in the state, including San Diego and Mayor Faulconer City. So we are continuing to work to represent all of the cities, large and small, in California.
Okay, and I do want to get to that support first, but first, Mayor Faulconer, could you take a crack at that question, just giving us a sense of what the economy was like in San Diego leading up to this, and when was it that you realized that this was?
No, Ben, I think like most cities, when you look back, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, significant growth that we'd all worked so very hard to have. And to give you a sense of context, because you mentioned the Great Recession, I was on the city council back then. When I think back to 2008, and the gap that we had to plug in San Diego at that time was 180 million. The budget that I've just put out shows a $300 million deficit for the city of San Diego. And like John just mentioned, look, our dollars for cities don't really come from Washington, D.C. or the state. It's by a strong economy. So in our case, it's sales tax, right? It's property tax and TOT tax, hotel tax. The tourism economy is a major, phenomenal, fantastic driver of our economy here in San Diego. I have never had to go through a month with no conventions at all. And to see the layoffs that have happened in our hospitality industry, our tourism industry, our restaurants, bars, that is not unfortunately unique to San Diego, but these are real people. These are our families. And so that the significance of this cannot be understated. And the tack that I am embarking on here is to make some of these tough decisions now and not try to rely on one-time funding that some cities may get. As John just mentioned, others are trying to get out there and do that, because the biggest thing that I think a lot of us as mayors are going to try to struggle with, which is, when does our economy come back that we see the return to some of the sales tax, the revenue streams that we used to have? That's a big question mark on that. And so the more that we can plan for that now, I think will put us better off sooner. But we are all going to have to enter in the process of making significant reductions in services, reserves, and doing things that none of us thought to get to the first part of your question, Ben. The budget that I was preparing 4 months ago is dramatically different than the one that I just unveiled.
Yeah. And a few months ago at this point probably feels like about a decade ago.
Yes. I mean, it's just, I remember the meetings vividly on some of the increases that we were going to be doing. And we all, as mayors, you all take personal pride in, different things that you're doing. And we had just raised library and rec center hours to the highest point in a decade. The most street repair we've ever done as a city, all things that, all of us, myself, my colleagues on the council were very proud of. And now to turn that around almost overnight, and to talk about reducing hours, to talking about focusing on, the very core services that you have to deliver as a city, public safety, sewer, water, trash pickup, knowing that you're going to have some phenomenal deficits in other programs, libraries, rec centers, the arts, et cetera. Those are very real, not just discussions, but decisions that we are making right now, because in the case of San Diego, our budget deadline is June 30th.
Got it. So, you both laid out some pretty devastating budgetary impacts of what's going on. And so is this something that residents in your cities are feeling the impact of now, or when will they start to feel that, and what will it look like for them? Have you been forced to lay off or furlough workers or reduce services yet? Faulconer, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, we've done some of that. We've had to repurpose, but the budget that I just put forward then shows 300 reductions. But that was my initial budget. The unfortunate reality is that when we are, like all mayors, took a snapshot in time about 3.5 weeks ago, it hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse. And so I will be putting forward a May revise here in the next week and a half that unfortunately is going to have to make further reductions and further service cuts. And nobody wants to do it, but at the same time, we have to have a balanced budget.
Mayor Dunbar?
We have been able to avoid any employee layoffs at this point. Our, I would say, top priority in terms of protection of our budget resources is for public safety. We have to maintain a level of law enforcement, and as we are in fire season, it's year-round these days, but especially now, we have to have our Cal Fire services available to us, and then to maintain the public safety, our health departments, and our average age here in Yountville is just under 67 years of age. So we have a senior population, and normally we have a mix of international travelers that we have a wide range of folks that come here. Our park and rec services have been completely shut down from their normal platforms, but we have been creative about offering what can be offered online. So we're still allowed to provide some of those services, but we've had to look at pausing on our pension obligation pre-funding, which we have been doing for some years now. That's going to have to be put on hold. And some of the other capital projects that we had in the pipeline, we're just going to have to put those on hold unless they are critical to our infrastructure. So we now have our fingers crossed that we don't have a sewer or water line break while we're doing this. But because, again, as I mentioned earlier, all of those fundamental municipal services continue. We are also trying to move forward with our housing crisis and providing additional inventory. That is looking more and more difficult as those types of major funding projects are much more difficult to find the resources for.
Right, and you just touched on this, but there we did just get a question from someone named Jess Nunez in Imperial County, who asked, "Can you see a scenario where public safety will have to make cuts with personnel?" And clearly, this is an issue when it comes to law enforcement. But as you mentioned, Mayor Dunbar, fire season is upon us, and San Diego is also familiar with the threat of fire, and so clearly that's going to be it sounds like it's a top priority for you, Mayor Dunbar. Mayor Faulconer, do you see that happening? Could you answer Jess's question?
Yeah, Ben, I do not see us making the reductions in sworn officers in the police or fire rescue for, I think, all of the obvious reasons that safe neighborhoods, fire protection is our number one priority as a city. It doesn't mean you don't look to shave off some costs in every department, but in terms of sworn staffing, no. We've been making a lot of progress in rebuilding our police department because we were not competitive in terms of our numbers, in terms of a variety of other things that I've really focused on over the last 4 years. So we've been adding that. Look, everything you do begins and ends by being a safe city. And so that will continue to be a huge priority for us here in San Diego. And to John's point and your point, yeah, we've been through some pretty horrific fire seasons down here in San Diego and Southern California. So keeping that as the top priority in terms of public safety, even as we potentially have to make some reductions elsewhere, is just where we're going to be. But we've been somewhat fortunate that coming out of the Great Recession, we really put a priority on building up our reserves. And so when I look back to where we were in 2008, again, back when I was on the city council, we didn't have a lot of options. We didn't have a rainy day fund. As I said, it's not a rainy day, it's a hurricane. But at the same time, so we're going to draw down on some of that will help, I think, modify that. Some of the reforms that we've made in terms of pension reform here in San Diego that the voters supported, 8 years ago, I think will position us well. But all of us are going to be in the same situation, which is how do you develop a budget for next year with your best estimates, with all of your economists and all of the indicators, not quite knowing when that economy is going to come back to levels that you think it might.
Right, and this is a concern not just for cities, but for anyone who's trying to make plans in this current economic climate. It's so unprecedented and it's so tied to what happens with public health. And so I think, whereas most economic modelers might be able to make projections based on where we think we are in the business cycle, this really just depends on when it's deemed safe to carry on as business as normal. Mayor Dunbar, did you have anything to add to that in terms of essential services like law enforcement or fire protection?
I would only echo what Mayor Faulconer was just saying, which is that has to remain the critical service that goes uninterrupted. We here in Napa County use our Sheriff's Department and our CAL FIRE resources. And again, they're the daily first responders for public health and safety. It's not just about disaster response. This is any type of medical response. We have to have those resources available to us. And it's in such a very different context now when you don't know if there is a part of our population that is immune to exposure to the coronavirus. It's not just about the impacts to wildfires or to other things that we're typically looking at as we enter the summer months. So I think it's going to be very challenging for us to represent all of those critical resources, and we're just going to have to get very creative about how we can save money where we can so that we can keep those services available.
Sorry, having some trouble with my mute button there. So one thing that Yountville and San Diego are very dissimilar in many ways, different regions of the state, dramatically different sizes. But one thing that the two cities have in common is a very large tourism industry. And we've sort of talked around this, but I'd be curious to hear both your thoughts and talking about how hard the tourism sector has been hit in your communities, what that's meant for your budgets, and also as people who live in your cities, what it's been for city life. Mayor Dunbar, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, this is one that's always difficult, I'm sure, for Mayor Faulconer as well to consider, as you talked about the loss of all of that significant business activity. So while we are having the dual impact, right, which is the public safety impact in our community, we're a very small town, 1.5 square miles. Our residents are used to getting out and just being socially active, engaging in our parks and on our streets, and that can't happen right now. So that is a frustration, a challenge. As I mentioned earlier, we have a senior population. We have a large number of our residents that require additional levels of medical assistance. It is harder for that to happen. Even getting out to the few restaurants that are available for takeout and some delivery service is not as easy for some as for others. The future that I look forward to is that while we have had several experiences with disasters, with wildfires and other things, we have seen a recovery in our tourist sector, and I think San Diego probably has a similar response history, which is we will see drive markets, meaning folks that can make it within an hour or two with the San Francisco Bay Area or Sacramento, Northern California areas. Those markets tend to recover quicker than international travel, for example, or even national travel that involves air travel. Air travel has taken on a whole new context. So we are hoping that we can see a similar recovery to other financial challenges as we have seen with more localized tourism that comes back to allow our restaurants in Yountville. We are known as the culinary capital of the Napa Valley for very good reason. We are very proud of all of our restaurants, but we also have reliance on our hotels and the experience that's offered here in the Napa Valley. If people don't come back soon, it's going to just exacerbate the financial challenges that we have.
Mayor Faulconer?
Yeah, I mean, it's the impact. I can't understate it. TOT is our third largest source of revenue here in the city, and to see that that drop virtually overnight, and again, trying to figure out, okay, when does the convention industry come back? We all want it to come back safely. We want it to come back strongly. We want our hotels to be open. We want our restaurants to be open when we can do so safely, and we're making a lot of plans for that. But the short-term impacts, you can see it. You can see it when you're out on the street to see whole hotels that are closed. Obviously, all of our restaurants. Again, getting back to we just announced two of our largest events in July. Made the tough decision, but the right decision to cancel in San Diego. That was our Pride Parade. It's one of the biggest and best Pride parades in the country, and of course Comic-Con, a real brand leader for us in San Diego at our convention center every July. I mean, you can't get a hotel room anywhere in the city. That's the type of ripple effect that we'd never seen. We never saw that in 9/11, even when we had some of the interruptions, the temporary interruptions on travel. So the sustained hotel losses, travel losses. I agree with John. I think we will be prepared to bounce back, particularly some of that local travel. But we're trying to make as many preparations as we can. Again, particularly for a market like San Diego, and the competitive nature that we have when it comes to groups and conventions, to make sure that we're going to be leaders, not just national leaders, but worldwide leaders on group safety, policies and procedures, all of the things that you're going to need to do to not only be safe in reality, but also back to that confidence of consumers and others that you're a city that is taking this seriously and has some pretty strong protocols.
And Ben, if I could just add one thing further, if we don't see this type of economic recovery, especially in San Diego and in the Napa Valley, just as our examples, we're already seeing cities, 9 out of 10 cities, as the League of California Cities has surveyed, are already looking at having to reduce or eliminate services and likely losing staffing. And so if we don't see a recovery in our primary business sectors, and for each of us, it's tourism, but there are other sectors that are still on hold that can't come back, we're going to continue to see additional services cut. Meanwhile, we are seeing cities taking on the additional financial burden of needing to buy appropriately to support our healthcare workers, additional protective equipment. We're seeing new, unbudgeted expenses. So that's just continuing to add to the expense line when we see virtually zero coming in, unless you have a big box store that's selling things online. And in some cities, that's a great savior for revenue. Most of us don't have that. And so we're seeing the expense lines go higher while the revenues stay at or near zero.
Right. And the both of you mentioned on the reserves that your cities have accumulated over the years, particularly since the recession. We have a question from Jen Lovett, wondering how many California cities have some kind of reserves. And Mayor Dunbar, if I could ask you to put your league hat back on. I mean, I don't know if you might not have a number off the top of your head, but can you give us a sense of sort of the distribution there?
The only number I could give you is fewer than 482. I know that, and I don't make light of it at all, but it's difficult to say. We have seen, as you referenced, in our league survey, $7 billion of lost revenues cumulatively in our cities. We know that not everyone has healthy reserves based on what we're trying to do, again, with housing, with homelessness services, with all of these other services that we were seeing the ability to start to respond to with our healthy economy and the resources that we had in place. But pension obligations continue to go up, and now we're looking at a whole new structure with workers' compensation. And so whether people have healthy reserves, what they considered healthy reserves 3 months ago, they're probably not looking at them the same way that right now here as we are in May. And I'm sure Mayor Faulconer is feeling something similar. Again, the numbers move, the decimal point moves, but the percentages of impacts in our communities are unfortunately very consistent.
Got it. So turning towards sort of what options cities might have, San Diego, with its large population, is getting some direct assistance from the federal government. The CARES Act, which is the big federal relief bill that the president signed at the end of March, gives direct assistance to cities and counties, but only if they have a population of over 500,000. So Mayor Faulconer, I believe the city of San Diego is entitled to so.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So what does that mean? Yeah, for the city's finances.
Yeah, no, and I would say, and once we're talking with my fellow mayors across the state, trying to help other cities that did not receive that direct allocation, either through the counties or others, is going to be a real issue for a lot of California cities that did not meet that $500,000 population threshold. We're working through right now, Ben. What are all the rules and regulations and how you use that money? Right, it has to be COVID related. It's not supposed to be used for revenue replacement. There's a lot of talk right now in Washington, D.C. Will there be another package that will get to revenue replacement? So those are the real-time conversations that we are having literally right now in terms of which expenses are going to be eligible for the CARES Act funding, in terms of city operations, in terms of small business relief. And so we're trying to get clarity as much as we can, because we know the need is so significant. And again, trying to do that in the context of these are dollars that we have received that you have to assume that these are one-time dollars. That if you're trying to fix ongoing expenses with one-time dollars, that's usually not a very good way to do things from a budget standpoint. And so we're going to work through all of those questions now, but we're going to, we were a little bit fortunate that we planned for some of this in terms of the pension and stabilization reserve that we first created a couple of years ago, that we're going to be able to draw down. As I said, San Diego, really a leader on pension reform years ago that I think has put us in a good situation. But we've got to put all of these buckets, if you will, together, eligible to do. And again, my focus is going to be not just short term for the next 5 to 6 months, but trying to look out onto the horizon so I'm not keeping ongoing expenses with revenue that I may not have.
So that's an important point to note. I think that this the grant or the assistance from the federal government, it has to be used for COVID related expenses. So it's not simply you can take that money and just say, oh well, hotel taxes fell by this amount, we'll just plug that hole.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
and look, the need is so great. And so as you're trying to, plug holes, to put the money where it's going to go to the most benefit and the most use, not just internally in the city, but as I said, some of those other needs, that will be, that I predict when the budget goes to the council here in San Diego in a few weeks, that's where a lot of the discussion is going to center around. And that's why we're spending so much time trying to really lock in what are some of those rules of the road in terms of do's and don'ts.
And Mayor Dunbar, not to rub it in, but Yountville is not getting help from the federal government. So what kinds of financial options do you have?
Well, we were hopeful that as Congress identified some of the cities that were left out, which was almost all, basically all but 6 of our cities in California did not qualify based on the population threshold. And there was some strong effort in Congress to help those of us under the 500,000 population through HR 6467. Unfortunately, not everyone in Congress saw that money going to cities and the impacts we're absorbing as appropriate. And so that's been very frustrating. At the state level, there is some discretionary money that is available through the money that the federal government has given to the state of California. And we are, as you can imagine, lobbying very hard with our state legislature to recognize that most of the cities in California do fall under that threshold, and we are all feeling the financial pain, some severely like in my community. What I also hope is there isn't just a uniform consideration of population size, as my colleague in San Diego has recognized that the stimulus money from the CARES Act is certainly welcome and helpful, but only on one side of the ledger with the expenses that are being incurred. That's absolutely legitimate and very supportive revenue, one time. And we will see this financial impact, I think, well beyond our next fiscal cycle. And so we are hoping that the state legislature is able to find out of the roughly, I think, $7 billion that was left to be discretionable, to maybe make up a word, that it could find its way to the smaller cities, especially those of us that have been significantly impacted with the revenue losses. And so not just the population sizes, but if you look at 75% or almost 75% lost revenue, you can imagine how impactful that is in a community, regardless of size. And if there are not the same resources available to the smaller jurisdictions, that's going to be a real challenge. So we're hoping that we can get that support from our state to help out all cities.
Right. So we got another question from Felicia Williams in Pasadena. She sent in this note and says, the governor and the legislature have been at odds with cities over the housing crisis and unfunded mandates. Do you think there's an opportunity for the state and local governments to work together going forward on the financial challenges ahead? I hope so. I hope so too, Felicia. But could you sort of look at that? You mentioned that you are, Mayor Dunbar, you mentioned that you're talking to legislators trying to work out some negotiations. But I mean, this morning we're seeing that the state has going to have a record-breaking deficit. So I imagine that conversation is a little bit strained these days.
Yes, we recognize that just like all of our cities, the state has been, it's taken a big hit, and we heard the number today. Again, totally understand that we're not even looking at a May revise; we're looking at a May redo to the budget. But what I will say is one of the few positives that we have seen from this pandemic crisis is a collaboration and cooperation at all levels in California. The city level, the county level, and the state level. And we are finding potentially some new ways to not only cooperate, but new ways to operate are, whether it be conversions of underutilized or unused hotel, motel properties for homelessness shelter in kind of a forced way, but seeing in real time and space how effective that might be. So we could potentially take that learning and turn it into something more long-term to help with that homelessness crisis. We may see the same thing with affordable housing. The sector has been put on hold in some cases, or at least greatly limited. There may be resources that are now available in that space to help us build more housing. Because other things were basically put on hold for 3 months. There might be these opportunities, and hopefully we will be able to work very well together. Unfortunately, crises like these are great unifiers out of necessity, and we hope that unity continues well into our recovery phase.
Mayor Faulconer, is San Diego getting much assistance from the state? What's that relationship?
Yeah, look, it's and I would just echo that. Now is the time for us all to really absolutely work together. And I think for the most part, if you look at some of the things that we've had to face as Californians, that has been a hallmark for up and down the coast in terms of cities. Look, I'm working very closely with my friend and colleague, State Senator President Pro Tem Tony Atkins. We used to serve on the council together here for a number of years. It's not about partisanship issues. It's about what's the right thing that we should be doing. And I think that's the spirit that we need to take here. I will just go back to something that John said, because spending a lot of time on it, I think every mayor is, and homelessness remains some of the most important things that we are doing. And right before I came back here for this session, I was over at our convention center. We've transformed that into a shelter for 1,800 folks and moved to a safe place for social distancing. But it's not just about a bed for a night. We've moved all of our resources there for our housing navigators to others with one goal. How do we keep people safe? How do we keep them healthy? But I think most importantly, how are we going to match them with a resource that gets them into a place of their own? And so we've made real headway on that. I've really tried to make that a focus in San Diego. Our point in time numbers just came out and saw that continued reduction because a lot of the aggressive housing programs that we pushed, I think, are working. Again, with one goal: how do we get people off the street? So as we look to coming out of this, and we will come on the other side of this by working together, I think to your questioner's point, it's going to be incredibly important that we are able to move quickly, particularly on new housing opportunities. And one of the big things that we are looking at is the conversion of hotels and motels that may be available to do that. We are moving pretty aggressively down here in San Diego with some of our own local dollars, and we will be looking for the state to help be a partner in that. Again, because we are united that you have to have the services, but you actually have to have a place for somebody to go. So I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges. But if we do it right and we move quickly, one of our best opportunities for success.
Okay. And speaking of assistance from the state, we have another question from Abel Guillen, who might be a city council member from Oakland or just someone who shares the name. But anyway, the question is, will the legislature look at lowering the 2/3 voter requirement for local tax or partial taxes, given the impact local governments and cities have? So Mayor Dunbar, do you see that in the cards?
I hesitate to speak on behalf of the state legislature.
Fair enough.
And so I will
a good
not
answer.
speak on behalf of the state legislature. But what I will say is I believe that all things are on the table, because this has really just thrown everything up in the air. And as it comes back to land, we'll be able to take a very fresh look at literally everything. And so I think that probably falls in that category.
Well, I think it also raises another question for me, which is something that I plan on writing about later today, I think, which is that, I mean, is that discussion about turning to voters, is that even in the cards now? Because I could imagine, as cash strapped as a lot of cities are going to be, or counties or school districts, voters might not be in voters might not be in a particularly giving mood, given how bad the economy is. So, I mean, do you see a way out for cities by turning to the voters in November, Mayor Dunbar?
I think we have to recognize the fact that literally everyone has been financially impacted by this. It's the individual resident in our communities. It's our city and town governments. It's the county governments and state governments. It's very challenging to generate enough resources, meaning money, to move the needle when we're talking at that very local level. We really need the support to come from Sacramento. The recovery is going to happen locally in our cities and our towns, but we can't do it alone, because the resources needed are at such a large proportion. It includes, again, all sectors, whether it's helping protect our public education system, which was already in a state of crisis with our school here in Yountville was closed. It was opened in the mid 1800s, and it closed due to the financial challenges of our unified school district. We're seeing those realities haven't gone away. They've maybe been knocked down our area of focus slightly in the last 3 months, but those are still very much present in all of our elected officials' minds. So it will be a challenge how we reach some of these outcomes. But as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of creativity that is available to us. I think everyone from the state government down to us acknowledges this. We need to take the opportunity to make the best outcome from this disaster as we can, and changing some of the rules or some of the processes might be part of that solution.
Mayor Faulconer, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about revenue and tax increases, I think there's no doubt that we're not going to be able to tax our way out of this recession. We have to look at continued reforms, streamlining efforts that we can do, particularly when we're talking about getting our economy back to work. Particularly talking about building more housing. CEQA reform comes top of mind to me immediately. About how do we build the houses that we need as expeditiously as we need, and to do it in a manner that puts Californians back to work for the results that we need. And so I agree with John that, look, our ability to recover is going to be driven by cities. It's going to be driven by a strong and healthy economy. And so that's why all of the plans that we are putting into place as regions, as cities and as counties, has to focus on getting us back to work safely in a way that people have confidence, so we can see some of those revenues return.
Great. Okay. And then one last question, which is looking forward beyond the sort of the short-term impact. There's so much uncertainty over when and how the economy will recover, and a lot of that obviously has to do with the trajectory of the pandemic itself. Some economists are talking about whether it's a V-shaped recession or a U-shaped recession, or even a W or whatever other letter you want. So beyond the immediate impact to city budgets, I mean, how do you both expect that this will impact city finances in the long term? Mayor Dunbar, you mentioned that you're putting on hold some of the payments, paying down the pension liabilities. So where do you see that implications will be?
I think that's exactly one of them. Is that some cities that, like my town of Yountville, we had the resources available to get ahead of some of those pension obligations. We were very proud of that. Do that right now. We're not going to fall behind, but we can't be ahead of it. We're going to see some of these other long-term impacts. I think significant infrastructure projects, not specific to the town, but for Napa County as a whole, we have a very important $20 million transportation project that was on a very good track to actually become a reality, that was going to have significant traffic mitigation and environmental positive environmental impacts. Those kinds of projects may need to be put on hold because financing is going to be so hard to get. Again, with the way the stock market is working, with the ability or inability to get bond financing, I don't even think we know clearly where we are in those spaces. But we can imagine, as long as the economy is still slowly recovering, all of those financial opportunities are going to be just as slow to return to us, to provide some additional, again, the significant capital projects, investments that the mayor and I were referencing in terms of making real needle-moving changes with housing construction. We may not have the ability to fund that like we thought we were going to just a few months ago. And so very hard to project the crystal ball right now. With our modeling for our town budget, we're looking at a June 1 kind of slow and steady, hopefully recover. But we're looking at, instead of 80% occupancy, we're looking at 10% hotel occupancy. So you can imagine the revenue difference there is going to make it very difficult for us to build back up from the significant financial losses we've taken. And it's true of cities throughout the state, right? The numbers maybe are different, but the reality is the same, that this is going to be a very slow process to come back from economically. And we're not even at the point where we have the public health crisis part of it figured out.
And Mayor Faulconer, what about your?
I would just say, Ben, I mean, they're absolutely linked. A strong economy and our ability to provide great city services go hand in hand. If you do not have that on the economic side, you're not going to be able to provide the services that all of us, I think, are accustomed to it and want to provide. And so all of the getting back to why planning on reopening and doing so safely is so important, because you have to have that real consumer confidence, public health confidence, that it's going to be safe to go to a restaurant. It's going to be safe to go to this retail store, that they believe in and support the precautions that are being put together and taken place. And when they do that, whether it's hand sanitations, all of the things that we're going to be doing, that then leads to getting on the other side of this economically as soon as we can. And so I think to some extent we can help control that by having that public confidence and putting these plans in place that are real, that are monitored, that we get public buy-in to, because that's how we're going to ultimately get back on track to provide all of the libraries, rec centers, street repair, healthy police and fire budgets, is when we have a healthy economy. And that's a truism in San Diego, and that's a truism in any city across California.
Great. Well, we are getting towards the end of the hour, but I want to thank both of you so much for taking the time, taking your lunch break to spend with us. And with that, I will pass it back to Vanessa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ben. And my thanks also to Mayor Dunbar and Mayor Faulconer for taking time out of your pandemic busy schedules to join us today. And thanks again to SoCal Gas for its support of this discussion and our upcoming Getting Through Coronavirus Explained events. If you have missed any of this discussion, you tuned in later, you can watch it again, as well as all our past events. They live here on the CalMatters YouTube channel. And we also create audio podcasts of these conversations as well. And they're available at our podcast hub, soundcloud.com/CalMatters. At the coronavirus outbreak and the shutdown in California, subscribe to our newsletters at calmatters.org. Subscribe. And you can also visit calmatters.org/coronavirus. And again, on this big day of giving, if you are able to support our nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism, please make a donation via our homepage at calmatters.org. Our next Coronavirus Explained event is a week from today, Thursday, this time, 1 p.m. It will be about nursing homes, what happened that caused them to be ground zero for COVID-19 cases and fatalities, what is needed to prevent that from happening again, and what the future of senior care will be like and should be like in this new normal. In the meantime, please stay strong, stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're done.
Okay.
Exhale.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mary. That was really helpful.
Thank you, Bennett. It was I was happy to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Great. Well,